He had vanished while the camp guards were busy congratulating themselves on catching the rest, and ever since, Miller had survived a string of near misses that ought, by all rights, to have ended his run weeks earlier. He had been questioned twice by men who were far too interested in his papers, slept one night in a hayloft with a cow that snored louder than any sentry, and once saluted a German officer out of pure reflex before remembering, too late, that civilians were not meant to salute. Somehow, each time, he walked away. Dopey. That was the nickname Beda had given Miller, because he had enthusiastically smashed all of the dorm's records in excitement because one had turned out to have a silk handkerchief sandwiched between the two shellac-grooved pieces. Miller turned the thought over in his mind as he made his way north again. He had never been sure as to whether he ought to be offended or oddly proud. After all, it took a special sort of fool to blunder through occupied France and live to complain about it. By the autumn of 1943 he was back in Dieppe, staring at the harbour he knew too well. The danger now felt strangely distant. The hard part was done. This was meant to be the easy stretch, the final leg that would carry him back to London. He told himself this firmly while consulting a crude map, only to realize he had been holding it upside down for several minutes. Dopey indeed, he muttered, turning it the right way up as if the sea might have been laughing at him. William Miller perched on a bollard to think and promptly slid off it, landing in an undignified heap with a clatter loud enough to make him freeze. When no one came running, he lay there for a moment, staring at the sky, and decided that subtlety had never really been his strong suit. Even so, the channel lay ahead like a promise. Boats came and went, tides obeyed their own quiet logic, and for once his luck seemed to be holding steady rather than teetering on the edge of disaster. Miller dusted himself off, straightened his cap, and smiled. If a man nicknamed Dopey could survive coldits, dodge patrols, and fall off harbour furniture without being arrested, then getting back to London now seemed almost straightforward. 88,888,888. Yet there was no one to follow her to Berlin. Josephine had, at least, been afforded an opportunity to go back to her room and dress. She slammed the door closed and wedged it with a chair, as she had done in the days when O'Reilly haunted the place. Ruined, dirty clothes off, and into a new set, her only other set, and she stood beside the closed door and breathed. She was going to Berlin to find out about Eve. 88,888,888. The Mercedes did not go where Josephine expected. Instead, to her deadening heart, it turned into Charlottenburg. The Rundfunkhaus hoved into view in the dying embers of the sun setting, and she got out, to be greeted by a face she knew. "I forgive you," William Joyce told her, as he ushered her into a small office, sitting behind a desk cluttered with scripts. The Lord Haw-Haw of the British imagination looking smaller and more frantic in person. Too much cocaine and not enough sleep, Josephine considered. But her being forced on a 4-hour drive to see her brother, the last time being in poor circumstances, and William not being able to look at her now for more than 5 seconds before being distracted did not bode well for her. At least she could try to escape, she told herself. The guards who had driven her up were waiting just outside. Josephine wondered now how she could escape, and considered the wires that were fixed into the radio transmitter, and the chair, whose 4 legs could be used to club all 3 men unconscious. "Josephine," Joyce continued, his voice carrying that infamous, mocking lilt. "I heard the news from Saxony. Eggers said you were instrumental. I'm glad you finally saw sense. There's a place for you here, in the ministry. We can show them that the Joyces are on the right side of history." This was a broken bar, not what she had been expecting. Eggers, who had conveyed through his impassivity her guilt, had convinced Josephine she had been caught out over the Colditz officers' escapes, and had exposed her hand in helping rather than hindering them. Instead, she looked at him, her brother, the man who had inadvertently destroyed her reputation and allowed Mosley to ruin her body, under the guise of trying to save her. Her heart beat faster as she thought of the files Eggers had promised, the shadow of Eve Mansour, and the burning fury she felt towards Sterling for the lies he was undoubtedly telling about her at that very moment. That, or bragging. "I'm not here to broadcast, William," she said, her voice like the rhyolite on which Colditz had been built. "I'm here because I have a debt to settle. And I hear Mrs. Schneider was shot for her part in it. 88,888,888. The rumble of the C-47 transport plane was a bone-shaking roar that filled the cramped fuselage. Red light bathed the faces of the men of 1 and 2 SAS, turning them into bronze statues of war. Paddy Mayne sat near the jump door, his sand-colored beret tucked firmly into his webbing, replaced for the moment by a jump helmet. His mind was a storm. He thought of the names he'd recited in Termoli, the men who hadn't lasted a day, and Reg Seekings, who had finally found the limit of his hate. He thought of Owen, the ghost who still sat beside him when he went fishing, whispering that being alive was the greatest penance of all. Beside him sat Henry Druce. Druce was checking his gear with a calm, methodical grace. He had a peculiar Sterling blend, David's suicidal bravery mixed with Bill's deep-seated decency. He caught Paddy's eye and nodded. "We hit the ground, we clear the path for the divisions," Druce shouted over the engine. "And then, Paddy, we turn east." "I haven't forgotten." Paddy didn't answer, he just tightened the strap on his leg bag. She was blood. He didn't care about the Free French or the Grand Deception. He was jumping into the dark to find a way to the sister Bill had used as bait. The jump light turned green. Go. 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 Paddy vanished into the slipstream, the cold air of Normandy screaming past him. As his chute snapped open, dangling him between a black sky and a burning continent, his only thought was a silent prayer to a god he didn't believe in: let Joey hold on. And let Eve Mansour rot. Because even though Bill Sterling dearly wanted the woman captured, Paddy thought to himself, he now hasn't the stomach to provide all the evidence for the prosecution at a trial, and she is sitting all happily in a cell in Whitehall Place. Waiting, no doubt, for something to turn up. And let them find the resistance cell that Clark had reignited, back to his days in Chanel, under the wire. Milo. Whoever it was in Leipzig was called Milo. They controlled the resistance cells in every direction of the city for 50 miles. Dear God, should Churchill get it into his mind to firebomb the city, he had heard it was a beautiful, learned place. Learned had to be shelved, for now. For there was a mission on. And, should they survive it, another. 88,888,888. The office suddenly grew ice cold. Whatever Josephine thought had been happening with her brother, she was dispelled of it when William turned suddenly to her. His self-satisfied smile didn't reach his eyes, it remained fixed, a mask of ideological zeal that had long ago replaced any scrap of brotherly affection. He didn't offer her a seat. Instead, he stepped aside to reveal a man standing in the corner, a man who radiated a cold, bureaucratic brutality that made Eggers look like a gentleman. "This is Hauptmann Palperum," William said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He is taking over the command at Colditz. The era of Eggers and his gentlemanly adherence to the Geneva Convention is over. The High Command has lost its patience." Prum stepped into the light, his uniform pressed to a razor edge. Unlike Eggers, who played psychological games, Prum looked like a man who enjoyed the mechanics of slaughter. "The Far One Quarterer has issued the Sagan order," Prum stated, his voice a flat, terrifying monotone. "We are following the example set at Stalag Luft 3. No more solitary cells. No more games of hide and seek. From this moment on, any escapee caught outside the wire of Colditz will not be returned. They will be executed where they stand. He looked at Josephine with a chilling lack of interest. And that includes those who facilitate them from within. Josephine turned to William, her breath catching in her throat. William. What is this? William Joyce picked up a piece of paper from his desk, a death warrant, signed in his own neat, cramped handwriting. He looked at her not as a sister, but as a stain on his carefully constructed reputation that needed to be bleached out. Did you truly think you could get away with it, Josephine? William asked, his voice dripping with a mix of pity and contempt. Did you think your adventure with the British SAS commander would go unpunished? You betrayed your country, your cause, and most importantly, you betrayed me. I cannot have a sister who is a common saboteur and a whore for the enemy. He handed the paper to Perham. I have handed you over for public execution, William said coldly. You will be taken back to the area of Colditz where the officers can see the courtyard. You will be made an example of before the very people you tried to liberate. A Joyce must stand for something, Josephine. If you won't stand for the Reich, you will die for it. Perham signaled to the two Gestapo officers waiting by the door. As they moved to seize her, Josephine realized, with full, crushing weight, that there was no escape. Sterling would by now have branded her a traitor to the Allies, and now her own brother had branded her a traitor to the Reich. She was a woman without a country, standing on the edge of a grave. Take her, Perham commanded. Tie and bind her, we do not want Anya broken bars or tricks. We have a train to catch. I want the gallows ready by dawn. 88,888,888. The car, which had suffered under a multitude of potholes, began to take on a smell of stale grease and the cold, metallic tang of the shackles that bit into Josephine's wrists. Opposite her, Hauptmann Perham sat with a terrifying, motionless composure, his face illuminated by the fitful glow of a single swaying lantern that cast elongated, skeletal shadows across the floorboards. The rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels over the road sounded to Josephine like the relentless ticking of a clock counting down to her own extinction, a mechanical herald of the gallows that awaited her in the shadow of the castle. When the car screeched to a momentary crawl near the Elbe crossing, the silence was broken only by the heavy, rhythmic snoring of Perham, who had closed his eyes beside her. Josephine felt a sudden, electric jolt of desperate defiance, a primal surge that overrode the deep, throbbing ache in her hips and thighs where Sterling had claimed her so ruthlessly. With a frantic, discordant clatter of chains, she lunged toward the door of the car, her shackled hands raised like a blunt hammer to strike at his throat, but the heavy wool of Perham's greatcoat muffled the blow. Before Josephine could claw for the gun at his hip, Perham was upon her, his movement a blur of predatory efficiency as he drove his polished jackboot into her ribs, pinning her to the grime-streaked floor of the Mercedes. He leaned over her, his breath cold and smelling of winter air, and ground his heel into her hand until her carpal bones groaned on the verge of snapping. "You will not rob the Reich of its theatre, Josephine," he hissed, his voice a sibilant whisper beneath the roar of the wind through the door chinks. "You will arrive at Colditz alive, for a Joyce must be seen to break before she swings." 88,888,888. Weeks before, and the air in the London courtroom was far stiller than the skies over France. Eve Mansour stood in the dock, her jasmine perfume long since faded, replaced by the smell of damp wool and prison soap. Dudley Clark sat in the back row, his face a stone mask. He had seen the final reports from the front, the cost of the deception, the bodies in the hedgerows, and the silent, terrifying efficiency with which Paddy and Druce were cutting their way toward Germany. The judge, a man who looked as ancient as the law itself, didn't look at Eve as he spoke. He didn't see the hurricane or the special case. He saw a traitor. Eve Mansour, you have been found guilty of high treason and the calculated betrayal of Allied operatives in a time of war. The gravity of your crimes against the Crown and the lives of those you endangered, specifically the operative known as Josephine Main, cannot be overstated. Eve remained motionless, her chin tilted at that same arrogant angle that had captivated David in his cell. The sentence of this court is that you be taken from hence to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, and that you be there hanged by the neck until you are dead. And may God have mercy upon your soul. The gavel cracked. It was a sound of finality that should have ended the story. 1,000 miles away, behind the jagged stone walls of Colditz, David Sterling sat in his cell. The news of the sentence had reached him through the prisoner post, a scrap of paper smuggled in a loaf of bread. He stared at the words, Mansour. Death by hanging. He should have felt relief. He should have felt justice for Josephine, who was currently being kept in the high security in the German area of the castle, or so they had been told. But David felt a cold, prickling sensation at the back of his neck, that of the instinct of a gambler who knows the house is cheating. He didn't believe it. He knew the world of Dudley Clark and the shadows of the so too well. Someone would want her. Someone would find a use for a woman who could charm generals and navigate the air like a ghost. She won't swing, Sterling whispered to the damp stone walls. Not if I can help it. Then, his thoughts turned to the wretched woman who had almost convinced him she was a double agent. Sterling stood up, pacing the 3 steps of his cell. The lust was long, burned away by the realization of what his loose tongue had done. The woman had been taken to Berlin, so he had heard. If somehow he discovered where she was, he knew what he would do to that sister of Haw. He wasn't the Phantom Major anymore. He was a man waiting. He would get out of this rock, and he would find her. And this time, there would be no talk of his brother, or death camps or Ear House. There would only be the end. 88,888,888. But when he would next meet Josephine was nothing like he imagined. 88,888,888. They had made excellent progress deep into the heart of Germany. Paddy Main stopped the company just outside Leipzig, and leaned against the fence post of a farm, looking at the river. Before we get there, Paddy told Hans Schmidt, not his real name, there is something I have to do first. Something we have to do, reiterated Roos, handing the man his leather water skin. Paddy frowned at Henry's enthusiasm. There is an broken Barso operative I need to take out with me, and I do believe that you know who she is. The conversation was perfectly staged, and served the purpose of anonymity for a leader of the German resistance and the Special Air Service parachutists. Their woods were dark, almost impenetrable, and the frost hardened the undergrowth into a landscape of brittle shadows. Main crouched behind a fallen oak, listening. Every twig snap, every distant bark, every crunch of German boots made his muscles tighten. Ahead, the village lay still, deceptively calm. His objective was clear, meet Druce's 2 company advancing from the east while cutting off the German reinforcements moving west. The pincer had to close perfectly. A single misstep, a single misjudged second, and the plan would unravel, men, and women, would die. Schmidty had agreed to guide them from Chemnitz. They were Austrian, hence their accents, and they would get to Colditz via the Mulder. But, to do it, they must capture the boats carrying ore and timber from Czechoslovakia and commandeer them, at turn, using them as a disguise. Paddy signaled his men forward and silently, they advanced, slipping through the trees, weapons ready but eyes sharp. A German patrol appeared, moving in the wrong direction. Main's hand went up, halting his men. A few minutes later, The patrol was neutralized quietly, and they continued, the pincer timing still intact. To the east, Druce's 2 company pressed forward, moving with precise coordination. Maine watched the horizon, counting the seconds, measuring the distance. He knew Milo's agents were moving inside the town. Druce would follow them from last tour, posing as check guards working for the Reich. Paddy's heartbeat. Any misstep could cost the SAS their lives. 88,888,888. A month earlier, while Sterling munched an overripe apple, disappointed to realize that part of it was not hollowed out, Eve Mansoura was already putting his news to work. She moved through the chaos of the Italian front with the fluid grace of someone who viewed war as a mere backdrop for her own private revolution. She reached a Naboer outpost tucked into a bombed-out villa north of the Sangro. The German intelligence officers there were harried, their desks covered in maps of the Termoli line, but they made time for her. She was a known quantity, the Algerian asset who brought the kind of truth that bullets couldn't touch. Eve didn't waste time on pleasantries. She leaned over the map, the scent of her perfume clashing with the smell of stale tobacco and cordite. "You are looking for the leak in the Funkspiel," she said, her voice low and steady. "You are looking for the woman who has been poisoning your radio circuits and shielding the French cells." The German major looked up, his interest piqued. "The British interrogator in Saxony? We have our suspicions, but her credentials are broken bar." "Her credentials are a masterpiece of fiction," Eve interrupted, a cold smile touching her lips. "She may be the sister of your radio puppet, William Joyce. But, she is also the sister of the men who are currently slaughtering your panzers at Termoli. She is Josephine Maine." Eve watched the realization sink in. It was a beautiful piece of tradecraft. By exposing Josephine, Eve wasn't just settling a score for the plane bomb, she was solidifying her value to the Reich. The more the Germans leaned on her, the more leverage she gained for her own people. If Josephine had spent months weaving a web of protection for the SO, Eve had just torn it apart with a single sentence. She's a victim of her own cleverness," Eve continued, her eyes as hard as flint. "She thinks she's the one playing the games. But David Sterling is a talkative man when he is in love, and your interrogator is now your most dangerous prisoner." As she walked out of the villa and back into the cool Italian night, Eve felt a surge of triumph. David was a fool, a magnificent, lust-blinded fool who had handed her his sister's life just to keep her in a room. Now, the hunt would move from the mud of Italy to the high towers of Saxony. Josephine Joyce, or Maine, as the executioners would soon call her, was about to find out that in the game of shadows, there is no such thing as a safe house.